In this next activity, we're going to take a look at documentation, and we're going to use the previous activities counter as the way to illustrate what documentation can look like within a program. So what I'm going to do is go into the code of my counter. And basically what I'm going to do is show you two types of documentation within here, but discuss all three in total. The first type of documentation I'm going to talk about is intrinsic documentation. And intrinsic documentation is basically the way we name elements within our program. So the names I've given my variables and the names I've given my objects. So as you can see here, my variable is called count, and that's because it relates to being an actual counting variable. The count goes up one by one every time the count button's clicked. So it's a logical name. It makes it easier for me to remember and recall when I need to use it. The same goes for LBL count. It's obviously where the count is displayed, and it's displayed in a label box, and that's why there's an LBL at the front. So it's LBL count. It's the label box that displays count. So that is intrinsic documentation. The next type of documentation that I'm going to talk about is internal documentation. And basically what that is it's notes I can add into my actual code, and they're not recognized as programming code by the actual software, and thus it doesn't create an error when I execute the program. So in order for me to put in internal documentation, I usually space out my text a bit, and then I press the apostrophe button. Okay, once you press the apostrophe button, the text is now going to be recognized as code, and you can probably see the little green apostrophe here, and that's the color the actual notes go, green for internal documentation. So for this, I'm going to actually describe what this first line of code does. So count equals count plus 1. That basically adds the value of 1 to the current count total. Okay, so the purpose of this line of code, count equals count plus 1, is it adds the value of 1 to the current count total. Okay, so I can actually describe my code, and this is useful if I'm doing this project collaboratively and I need others to understand my coding as well, and it helps me illustrate to them what the actual lines mean. So I'll do the next line as well. So once again, I'm going to go next to it and I'm going to tab out, okay, my cursor so that it lines up with my other note, apostrophe to start off my note, and then this line I'm going to describe what essentially is happening here. So in this one, the label LBL count displays the count value. Okay, so I've illustrated now basically that this label box displays the count value. Okay, so it really adds a bit more meaning to my code and makes it easier to understand for others. Okay, now the third type of documentation is actually external documentation, and these are the notes I do outside of my program. So this may be things such as algorithms I draw up that describe line by line how I plan on approaching the program, and may include things such as pseudocode or flowcharts in order for me to better understand the creation of my own program. But obviously external documentation, as stated, is external to the program itself, so I wouldn't actually write any notes in here. So in summary, let's use internal documentation to write the three definitions of these types of documentation. So I'm going to use an apostrophe once again, and firstly it was intrinsic documentation. So intrinsic documentation. Okay, and this was the naming elements within a program with relevant names so that they are easier for the programmer to remember and recall. Okay, and the next one was internal documentation. Okay, these are notes written within the programming code using the apostrophe symbol. And then finally was external documentation. Okay, notes such as algorithms written outside the program. Okay, so I hope this actual activity has given you a better understanding of basically the three types of documentations that can be used when developing a program. Intrinsic documentation, which is the naming of variables and objects with relevant and logical names. Internal documentation, which is using the apostrophe symbol to add notes into your programming code, making it easier for others to understand your programming code. And external documentation, which is algorithms such as pseudocode and flowcharts, which are done outside the program, allowing the programmer to get a better understanding of what they're creating. So I hope this gives you a good understanding of documentation in programming.